In the shadowed valleys of a once thriving world, where mountains cradled secrets and rivers whispered forgotten tales, humanity clung to its last breath. The apocalypse had come, not in the form of nuclear fire or cosmic cataclysm, but with scaled wings and fiery breath. Dragons, ancient and wrathful, descended upon the remnants of civilization. Their arrival was heralded by screams of terror and the crackling of burning cities. Skyscrapers crumbled like forgotten dominoes, and the air tasted of smoke and despair. Survivors huddled in makeshift shelters, their eyes wide with fear. They whispered stories of the old days when the sun was golden and the laughter echoed through the green valleys. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome back. And if you didn't guess, it's dragons today, in the form of a ceiling decoration or a mobile. So I hope you're all super well, and I'll take you through this project. So as you can see, I started out with sketching some wings onto some paper, gluing it to the board, and then carefully using a new blade, cutting it out on the cutting mat. Please always be careful when you're cutting, because these knives do catch and snag and then they fly off, so always be careful. It took a couple of times to get through the wood, but then eventually it would snap off. I then started to sketch what I imagined would be the wing bones, which would be stuck with p.v.a. foam, which later on you'll see in the video I used another technique which I could have used here, and I think it would have looked pretty cool, but never mind. So I did that introduction with AI generated photos or images. They're not photos, are they? They're images. And then I came up with a story. Did you like that? Please comment or something. For making the body, I made a sketch, and then I decided to sketch it straight out onto the wood and cut this off. So I'm making a mobile. Really, I haven't seen any mobiles around for a while. Is it old school, or is it me just not seeing them? Do you see them? And then I marked out the backbones or the spikes. I marked them out with a ruler so I could get them nicer looking. Zigzags and aesthetic, I think is what I mean. I cut his spikes out with diagonal cuts, zigzags on both sides, until they were ready to practically snap off, and then I used the knife just to clean the edges. Then I made some sides for him to bulk out his side a bit. Again, marking it out, cutting them out, and then gluing them on. Back with the wing, I wet the whole surface with a solution of p.v.a. glue, wood glue or white glue. I knocked the camera a couple of times with my head, as you can see. And I covered it and then papered it. The head, I cut out a basic shape which would fit on to the neck that I have. And then I drew some bulk, which would be for cheeks. But again, later in the video you'll see a technique which I could have used and wouldn't have needed these bits of wood, or wouldn't have needed to cut them, and just used little off bits instead and stuck those down. Back on with the top of the wing, again knocking the camera with my head, and p.v.a. glue with water. This gives it a really nice texture, and I use the water to be able to break the paper off. Then we glued the body onto their main body. to make the scales, I had some cardboard and decided to make 2 edges while I was cutting. So I did all the cuts one way, all the cuts the other way, all the way around, and I did this with quite a few bits of card until I thought I had enough. And then from this one, I turned them into 2. That should be enough to start with. I cut them to size and then started to glue them down. And I figured it didn't matter if it went over either edge because they'd be trimmed down later with a cutting knife or a sculpting knife. So I hope you're enjoying the video so far. We've got the painting to go through next. So if you're enjoying it, I ask you to give me a like and a subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you. With the head, again, started with the glue and the paper. I wasn't so convinced. Okay, to give it a couple of legs, I drew out on a piece of cardboard there, as you saw, and then I traced it to scratch it out onto the wood. Why I didn't just draw it straight onto the wood, I don't know. So I had to cut these out, again 2 of these, a few cuts until they snap off. I cleaned the edges up. And off camera, I stuck the chest plates and some more scaling. I used hot glue on these scales, and be careful with your fingers. Then tidied up the edges again. Then I stuck some scales on the underside of his tail. So what are your thoughts or beliefs on dragons? Why don't you leave a comment? Here I am sloshing my p.v.a. and water solution all over the model, and I placed tissue paper over the top and worked it down and in with a brush. This is quite a lengthy process, but I think it's well worth it. It brings the whole model together and gives it a skin. On the head, I made a pulp by tearing up the tissue and letting it stand in the solution with a little bit more glue until it was a pulp. Then with the tweezers I started to build up the facial areas, and so not needing those bits of wood that we spoke about earlier. I found this pulp really nice to work with. Very easy to build up the layers, and then you can mould it by tapping it with the tweezers. The downside to this is that it takes a long time to dry. I used a hair roller for the claws. I cut off the bits that I wanted, then made a little divot and stuck them into position, again with hot glue. I then stuck some scales onto its foot and then started to sculpt with papier-mâché around and around and around it. So we must be around the 10th minute of this video. I've got to say, I'm really happy that you're still here. And just so that I know that, please give me a like or a comment or even a subscribe. You know you want to. Thank you. Now I need the eyes. So I got a bead out of my bead box and cut it in half, long ways. And here I stuck it into position with a pearl of hot glue. I then added a little bit of papier-mâché around the outside of the eye to give it some depth. And carried on moulding his mouth and some horns, some knobs, some lumps on his head. Now the head is dry enough to be glued to its body. Its neck is made of a slot that goes in easily to the body. I added a few more cardboard scales and carried on sculpting its head and neck with our fantastic dragon pulp, building up the layers between a little drying time by the fire. It's teeming down with rain here and it's cold in southern Europe. What about where you are? I took my hand drill and made an opening for a horn made by a shard of wood and then covered in our dragon pulp. I went all the way up his back as well. And for the tail, I cut 2 bits of wood and hot glued them to the end of his body. I then attached 2 fins and then covered them with our pulp. So now we've got everything complete, we're going to set it aside to dry overnight. And the next step, of course, is we started with a primer to seal everything up and give us a uniform surface to start on. I mixed up a purple blue colour and used this as a base coating and painted everything liberally with it. I then used the brick red with a touch of normal red, looking for a vermilion type of colour. And I dry brushed this quite heavily from the top of his body downwards, including dabbing paint on its head and tail. With each dry coat that I went over with, I added a little more pure red to the colour to keep making it lighter. I thought I was going to put some orange tips on the scales with yellow highlights, but that I think was going to overdo it. So I carried on with a little more dry brushing with just the orange, going over the edges and the larger surface of the scales. I went over his chest with the beige colour, and its second coat had a little bit of yellow added to that beige. I've got to say I enjoy the painting, I think because it brings the piece together. Then I went back to its head and gave it some red highlights. I think this adds a little contrast. I then went over the whole model, dry brushing and just white. We started with the underside of the wings to highlight the bones and all the texture there. This is a good way of sort of aging the piece. And then all over the body, practically one direction. And giving it some age. Then I went over very gently, dry brushing the head and the tail the same. This brings the whole piece together. Here I needed to find my steady hand for the eyes. I mixed up some yellow with some beige and then a tiny amount of green. I put a couple of coats on to bring up a nice solid colour. To attach the wings to the body, we need to make a few holes. I kept the model steady by putting some bits of wood underneath its spine so I could drill the holes without damaging it. We need to find its centre of balance. You can do this by holding the central spike. We need to space the holes evenly, either side of the centre. I scratched off and cleaned up any excess where the drill had pushed through. Once we made the holes, I had to thread some cord through. I used the hand drill to push it through the hole. If you don't have one of these drills, you could use a small screwdriver or a skewer or anything that's got a point on it. So we're coming up to the end and the results. I'd like to say thank you for being here and watching this far to the end, and please give me a like or a comment, or even better, a subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I had this black cord, but you can use anything. I then made a couple of slits on the wings. The fishing wire will go that will suspend it. And the final touches in its eyes with a soft tipped permanent marker pen. I used fishing wire to attach the wings to the support stick. Again, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a mark of a like or a comment or a subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much.